especially our guests and the family,
Thank you.
and our friends from the Baha'i World Center, and all the other distinguished uh, guests. We are in our penultimate lecture in a lecture series in Baha'i Studies. We would have another one next week, which is of course the day that our guests are arriving, or they plan to arrive in Israel on their other occupations. And we are very happy today to introduce our guest, Dr. Geeta Gandhi Kingdon, which is any relation to Gandhi, or it's because no, it's just Professor Kingdon holds the chair of education, economics and international development at the Institute for Education, London University, and was until recently a research fellow at the Department of Economics, University of Oxford. She lectures in development economics, and her research interests include economics of education, labor economics, and the economics. Her current research interests centers on statistical analysis of school effectiveness, teacher incentives, impact evaluation of education policy interventions, and the political economy of education. She has also extensively researched gender differences in the within household allocation of education and health expenditures, as well as in developing countries. She sits on the editorial board of 4 academic journals and does advisory work for both national governments and for bilateral and international donor agencies. We are very much happy to have you here and to give us today's lectures on women's education and socio-economic development, the pathways of in the Hebrew version on the education of women and its impact on the socio-economic development.
That's fine. That's fine.
So, therefore, without the pathways of him, but it's very. So I'm sorry. So the floor is yours, and
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much. First, let me start by thanking Dr. Soli Shahpar very much for kindly inviting me to give this lecture, and also Dr. Hoda Mahmood, the other center. It's a great pleasure to be here in your beautiful country. We have our family have been here a few times, and we love it here. So thank you for the opportunity for coming and seeing your country again, which is on this occasion it is because I agreed to come and do this lecture. So the topic of today's presentation is the one that Dr. Shahpar just read out: education of women and socio-economic development. This topic basically provides some evidence, a kind of a summary of the social science literature on education of women and its impact on social and economic development indicators, and to try and correlate that with my understanding of Baha'i stances on these issues. Baha'i writings have some remarkable statements about girls' education. Firstly, that and secondly, that not until the equality of opportunity in education is established will the foundations of war be removed. Now, I think, let me just not paraphrase these, but give you the actual quotations themselves. Abdul Baha says he's a central figure in the Baha'i faith. He was the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith and the center of the covenant, as it's known as. The education of girls is of far greater consequence than that of boys. Greatest energy and dedication. And again, in another passage, he says, "Devote ye particular attention to the school for girls, for the greatness of this wondrous age will be manifested as a result of the progress in the world of women." And I have a third quotation relating to point number 2. The education of women is more important than the education of men. When all mankind foundations of war will be utterly destroyed. Without equality, this will be impossible. These are dramatic claims, and these are very challenging ideas which deserve study, I believe, in order for us to understand their meaning and their ramifications. The principle of gender equality in education, which is just one facet of the general principle of equality of the sexes, was put this principle forward in the mid-1800s. It was set forth more than 50 years before Western thought added gender equality to its list of rationally based moral principles of relevance to political life, such as secularism, democracy, rights of the individual, and so on. And long before it became enshrined in numerous international and national documents as a politically correct universal Tehran in the 1880s records that the early Baha'is suffered persecution partly for their belief in this principle of gender equality. So again, let me quote from Curzon's book. Analyzing the causes of the persecution of the Babis and Baha'is in Iran, Curzon notes that, quote, the charge of immorality against Babis and Baha'is seems to have claimed for women by the Bab, which in the Oriental mind is scarcely dissociable from profligacy of conduct. I'll read that beautiful Victorian language again. So he's saying basically that part of the reason why Babis and Baha'is were persecuted was partly because of the much greater freedom claimed for women by the Bab, which in the in the Eastern mind, Curzon is claiming, giving women equal rights, and encouraging women to take part in all areas of all walks of life is no less than encouraging them to be immoral. So it's a principle for which Baha'is have suffered too, according to Curzon. Now, apart from saying that education of women is very important and that it's matters, they acknowledge many different pathways through which women's education matters, but they are very emphatic that as the woman is the mother, she is the first educator of the next generation, and this is a very important pathway through which women's education has its beneficial impact. And this alludes to the nurturing benefits of women's education and the home teaching benefits of women's education. Present the findings of social science research, and when I say social science research, I'm afraid it's going to be economic research or research that is done predominantly by people whose disciplinary background is economics. So it's mainly applied econometric research. Statistically based methods have been used. And secondly, I'm going to examine the pathways by which schooling acts on these outcomes, these socially beneficial in the social science literature to the Baha'i teachings about the purpose of women's education, and in particular to consider the extent to which these findings in the social science literature provide support for the stress that we find in Baha'i teachings on women's education, and to what extent the findings of this literature provide support for the pathways that are particularly emphasized in the Baha'i teachings. There are two broad one is equity and the other is efficiency. Well, equality of the sexes in the sense that equal opportunity for men and women to develop their potential, their access to health and education, their ability to develop their potential in every way, their command over resources, all of these things, equality in these dimensions has an intrinsic value. It doesn't need a justification based value. We may value equality because it leads to some gains. And Baha'i writings emphasize both of these reasons for valuing gender equality. But here in this presentation, I'm only going to look at one aspect, namely the economic and social efficiency of women and men's education. So in this first part, I'm going to look at some of the evidence on the impact of women's education on economic raises their human capital, their productivity, and their contribution to economic growth as much as male education does, men's education does, then any disadvantage that women have in terms of their education vis-a-vis men is economically inefficient. I mean, society gains less than if it was to give equal education to women. It turns out from the economic literature, when there's a whole literature in economic data in the past 40 years on every single country in this world, you do have estimates of the rate of return to education for men and women. You can compare them and you can see what is the wage increment from one extra year of education. When you look at those studies, you find that by and large the economic benefits of women's education are roughly similar to the economic benefits of men's education. In other words, the wage increment arising from each extra year of men's education is comparable to that. Slightly higher. So for instance, if each extra year of education for men raises their earnings by 10% over the lifetime, each extra year of women's education is rewarded by 11%. So of an order of about 10% advantage. And this literature is summarized in many places, but one that I'm citing here is by Professor Paul Schultz of Yale University in a paper which he published. Now, while the economic benefits of girls' education are roughly equal to those from boys' education, it turns out that the non-economic benefits of girls' education are far higher than those from boys' education. Specifically, female education has powerful effects on the total fertility rate, on the infant mortality rate, on the female disadvantage in child survival, because we know that in developing countries, for example, 100 children do not survive in the first 5 years after birth, but that this figure is very skewed by gender. Child mortality is much greater for female children than for male children. So women's education is associated with less female disadvantage in child survival. Female by contrast, has relatively much smaller effects on these social outcomes. And this is what the literature shows, and I'm going to show you some studies just to illustrate and give you a feel for some of the kinds of studies that have been done in this literature. A large applied literature has accumulated. This is spurred by availability of data. We now have world fertility surveys, demographic and health surveys, integrated of data from about the 1990s onward, early 1990s onwards, and that has led to a great upsurge in applied research in these areas. What I have done is to only survey the literature on the impact of women's education on just a few outcomes, in particular total fertility rate, the infant mortality rate, and child education, and maybe one or two studies on child health. Other beneficial social outcomes. So one study, in fact I'll stand up because I think I can maybe talk to this a bit better if I'm stood here. So one study in the literature that I would like to showcase as an example of the kind of studies and the kinds of results that are arising in this literature is by Subbaraman Rani, published in a journal called Economic Development and Cultural Change. What this study did is to regress the total fertility rate of 1985 on the secondary school enrollment rates of men and women, of boys and girls, for the year 1975, because it's quite a reasonable thing to do, because women and men who are aged about 14 to 17, 14 to 18, secondary school going age, in 1975 would have been of childbearing age 10 years later. So therefore it's in the country. Data is from 10 countries. The objective of the paper was to examine the effect of education on fertility, controlling for other factors, for example, the country's family planning service provision, a measure of that, the per capita income of the country, the degree of urbanization of the country, and so forth. The results show that only female secondary school enrollment had a highly significant negative effect on total. with total fertility rate. Similarly, in the same study, as I said, there were two dependent variables. One was the total fertility rate, and the second one was the infant mortality rate, and that's the number of infants who die before reaching the age of 2 out of every 1,000 infants who are born. And again, only female education was a significant determinant of the total fertility rate. Male with 1985 infant mortality rate. This is an example of a paper that uses cross-district data, district level data, but from one country only. So you're controlling for, if you like, for socio-cultural differences across the different districts within India. This is for a study for India, whereas if you're looking at study, but you have not been able to control for all the factors. So this is taking a different look at it because it's using district level data for any one country, in this case India. What they found is that, so here they were looking at the impact of female and male education on 3 different outcomes. One was the total fertility rate of the district, second was the under 5 child mortality rate in the district, and the third was female literacy rate had a strong negative impact on the total fertility rate, on the under 5 child mortality rate, and also on the female disadvantage in child survival. District male literacy had no significant effect on this, on these 3 outcomes. Interestingly, districts per capita income, so a measure of how well off the people in the district are, the degree of urbanization of the district, which is a measure of how modernized it is, and significant impact on the total fertility rate. While they did have a positive impact on child survival equations, the effects of these 3 variables were small compared with the powerful effects of female literacy on these 3 outcomes. Here's a table from this study. I don't think I've got time to go through it, but if you just see, you just eyeball the figures that data, and different methods have, 2 different methods have been used in the last 2 columns, but you can see that the female literacy variable, the stars represent statistical significance, and you can see that across the board, whatever methodology is used and whichever year's data is used, there's a statistically significant relationship between the district female literacy rate and the total fertility rate, which is the dependent variable in this table. You can see that male literacy rate has no effect. Poverty, urbanization, scheduled caste, have significantly higher fertility rates. So we can see that just the size of that effect is quite large. In India, you have districts that have a district literacy rate of about 30%, 28%, 26%, some of them, and that have literacy rates above 90%. In Kerala and Tamil Nadu and some of the other states, Himachal Pradesh in the north, also have some districts that have high literacy rates, upwards of 90%. From a district which has 30% literacy rate to a district that had over 90% literacy rate, that would be an increase in literacy rate of 60 percentage points. Multiply 60 by 0.025 and you get a figure of 1.4. That's a huge effect, because if average total fertility rate in India is, let's say, 3.4 children per woman, a reduction of 1.4 child per woman would bring it down per woman in order to have a stable population. So it's a powerful effect indeed. Here's an example of a study that uses household level data, and this I've cited. This is from a journal called World Bank Economic Review. This paper was published in the WBER. Here they look at determinants of fertility in 14 sub-Saharan African countries using household level data. They found female primary education has a negative relation with fertility in only about half of these 14 countries, but that female secondary education was associated with lower fertility in all 14 countries. And the strength of the effect of education on fertility increases with years of schooling. Among women who were ever married, husband's education had no significant relation with fertility in 1/3 of the countries, but when both men and women on fertility than did men's education. Here's a very similar study for Tanzania and Uganda, published in the EDCC, and finds similarly that the effect of education, female education, on fertility is non-linear. It's low at primary level of education, it's there, but as you increase levels of education to completed primary, middle, and secondary, the size of the impact of women's education. These studies also do simulations to show the relative size of the effect from female education onto fertility and the size of the effect from other interventions that the treasury of that country could have undertaken, alternative public interventions. And what it shows is the same thing that I've said, but in terms, if you like, in monetary terms. So, for example, gains in terms of countries' data. In these 72 countries, the average secondary school enrollment ratio of girls in 1975 was 19%. That means of age-eligible secondary school age-going girls, 19% were actually enrolled in secondary school. If instead of it having been 19%, if the secondary school enrollment ratio of girls had been 38%, the number of births in 1985, if the secondary school enrollment ratio of girls had been double what it actually was in 1975. If instead of 19% it had been 38%, what would have been the number of births in 1985, 10 years later? They find that it would have reduced the number of births in 1985 by 29%, whereas doubling family planning service provision of the countries, whatever it was, the average across the In other words, the size of the effect from female secondary enrollment was more than 8 times the size of effect from doubling family planning service provision. Of course, unfortunately, the study did not estimate the relative costs of these two different interventions. But if the costs of these two things had been the same, we could say that the rate of return to investing in female gains in terms of deaths averted were also striking. Doubling the female secondary school enrollment ratio in 1975 would have reduced infant deaths by 64% in 1985, while doubling the number of doctors would have reduced the number of infant deaths by a mere 2.5%. And doubling per capita income from an average of $650 in these 72 countries, doubling it to $1,300 would have had no effect. From female education is quite remarkable. Now, up to now, what I have said seems to imply that correlation necessarily means causality. Yeah, we've said, well, look, when we relate these two things, we find that increased education leads to increased, beneficial outcomes. But all these studies have correlation, but it is just potentially just a correlation. There is no presumption, or if there is a presumption, it is wrong to presume that there is causality in this relationship. So the question is, to what extent can we separate correlation from causation, and is there really a causative effect from female education onto these? Higher mother's education is associated with higher child health. We say that if you increase mother's education, you lead to better child health, implying causality, implying that there is a nurturing effect. If you make women more educated, they will provide their children better nurture so that they will have better child health. In fact, reality could be more like this, potentially. But that mother's health endowment, this thing that is unobserved, it is an inherited, inherent, trait of a person. They inherited a certain kind of health endowment genetically from their parents, and better, people with better health endowment end up getting more education. Genetically, they pass on their better health endowment to their children, so their children health without there being any causation. So this is a potential possibility which one must acknowledge. Similarly, one could have the same thing with respect to mother's education and child education. It could be mothers who are innately more able, who inherited higher ability from their own parents. Obviously, people who are more able find it easier to pass exams, so they will go on to acquire, therefore go on to acquire more education, and therefore there needn't be a causative relationship between mother's education and child education, even if there is a high correlation between them. So where does this leave us? And of course, for policy, it matters a great deal whether it is that kind of a relationship or that kind of a relationship. Because if it is this relationship, it's all to do with nature. Yeah, you've just naturally, you're you get this any correlation, but there's no causative effect, and that is all to do with nurture. So which it is makes a lot of difference from the point of view of public policy, because if it is indeed this, then there is no point, in a sense, for public policy to invest money in subsidizing education, or in particular girls' education as such, because by educating you're not improving the lot of the next generation. Spending money on education makes a lot of sense in instrumental terms. The literature does consider the rather pessimistic possibility that this relationship that we've been seeing in this literature is spurious. And these, what I have called the so-called second generation studies in this literature, do explicitly ask, they don't just establish correlations, they try and establish causation. Generational transmission, or whether it's also nurture. Educated parents provide better upbringing. Baha'i writings clearly imply that parental education does improve nurture in a very powerful way. That is the implication of what Abdul Baha has said about the importance of women's education. But is that supported in the empirical literature? So how do studies seek to establish causal relationships? How do they decide whether it's only nature? Studies and studies using other econometric techniques. So in the twin studies, the idea is this, that within a pair of twins, especially if they're identical twins, genetically identical twins, one can assume that inherited ability is the same in a pair of identical twins. So that you have netted out the effect of genetic ability come from these two individuals within a twin pair, and relate the difference in education between the children to the difference in education between the twins themselves. If there is a relation, then you know that that relation is because of differences in nurture that comes from difference in the different level of education of these two members within a twin pair. So that's what these twin studies do. Adoptee studies are much, and therefore any relationship between the adopted mother's education and the adoptee children's education must be a nurturing effect rather than a genetically passed effect. And the third studies use a kind of methodology known as instrumental variables method. Basically, the idea here is if one can isolate somehow, and it's difficult to do, but one can sometimes find instruments, good things, that that is not due to their ability, but which can be ascribed to some exogenous factor that has led to some part of a person's education being higher. So, for example, if you think of the Vietnam draft lottery number, Vietnam draft lottery was assigned randomly, in 1967 or something like that. I can't remember exactly which year it was, in America, to draft young men for active service in Vietnam. A number. If your number was low, you were very likely to get called up for active service in Vietnam. And if your number was high, you knew that your number would be called if and when needed, in the distant future, maybe in 2 years' time or 1 year's time and so on. So if you had a low number, you had a incentive to enroll in school and in college as a way of avoiding the draft. Whereas if you had a high number, you didn't have such an incentive because there was no So this Vietnam draft lottery number ended up being a very good instrument for years of schooling, because it ended up being correlated with years of schooling without being correlated with ability. Because the individual's decision to go to college was determined, largely with the motive of avoiding a draft, rather than because, well, I'm more able, therefore I'm going to go to university. So you see what I mean? There are other ways in which one can, social scientists have sought to find that little, but because of some exogenous thing that happens that gives them certain incentives to enroll in schooling. And when you can do that, then you can say that any impact from that part of education on their children's schooling must be due to upbringing, the nurturing effects of education, rather than due to the genetically passed ability part of it. And I don't have the time to go through some individual studies to show. Most of these newer studies pay attention to issues of causality. They confirm that there is a significant causal effect from women's education onto both child health and child education, supporting the nurture interpretation, which is not to say that the nature interpretation has been ruled out. Obviously not, absolutely not. And some of these studies, a subset of these studies, try to apportion the total effect into a nature. When only a subset of these studies look at the effect of both mothers and fathers' education, and if we just take that subset, most of those studies find mother's schooling has a bigger impact on children's outcomes than does father's schooling. So these are some studies using twins data. There are some problems with this methodology which are listed. Antonovics, using the same data, showed that they were wrong and they found an effect. And this is a study using data on twins from Sweden, and it found an effect. These are studies using adoptee data. Of course, there's a few studies because data requirements are so stringent, and very few databases of adoptee children. Sample sizes are usually small. And there's a paper in Journal of Health Economics. It's high from the US. And lastly, a list of studies that use the instrumental variables method from Guatemala, Zimbabwe, 3 studies from the UK, and 1 from Indonesia. So the summary so far is that Baha'i teachings lay a huge amount of emphasis on women's schooling. While we find that this emphasis is just in terms of fertility rates, mortality rates, health and education, other interventions have much smaller effects than the size of the effect of girls' education. And these powerful benefits from female education suggest they provide some insights into why it may be that Baha'i writings in the 1850s, from the 1850s, have been emphasizing women's education so heavily. Indeed, the chief in an article which he wrote for the Scientific American, he wrote that educating girls is quite possibly yields a higher rate of return than any other investment available in the developing world. So the second part of this talk looks at the pathways through which women's education impacts social outcomes. So in this part, I ask how women evaluate the so-called bargaining power mechanism through which women's education is hypothesized to act on these outcomes. I ask whether education has to raise women's earnings for its benefits to accrue, and I try and examine the trade-off between economic and non-economic pathways. Now, the economics literature implies that the most important pathway by which women's education matters to their women's education raises the value, economic value, of women's activities in the labor market, and also, partly as a result of this, it raises their bargaining power within the home. Baha'i writings acknowledge the economic pathway as an important pathway. Indeed, they exhort women to acquire knowledge in all the sciences and the arts, and they exhort women to enter into all the professions and all. the economic route is clearly not the only one. Another mechanism, another pathway of impact from women's education that is heavily emphasized in the Baha'i teachings is that maternal education directly raises children's human capital. That means their health and their education. To analyze the pathways through which education acts on fertility, it's useful to distinguish the impact of education on desire the desired family size. So I'm going to look at how education affects both of these things. So in looking at the relationship between education and desired family size, there are three major classes of ways in which education reduces desired family size. Firstly, it raises the value of women's economic activities by increasing the reward of an hour or a day spent in the labor market. To one's time. And this raises the opportunity cost of staying at home and bearing and rearing children. In other words, what you forego in the labor market for each extra child you have is higher if you're more educated, and therefore you're going to desire smaller families. The second mechanism is attitudinal. It's suggested that more educated women, if it is the case that there's a child, then more educated women will choose to have fewer children but of better quality. This is known in the literature as the child quantity quality trade-off. And so they will have aspirations, higher aspirations for fewer children, but of better quality. Then the media mechanism. It has been shown that educated women are more receptive to media messages. This is from the National Family Health Survey of India from 92-93. The same survey has been repeated twice since then, 98-99 and 2004-05. So I could have produced a table from that. This one happened to be ready, so I just slotted it in. But what we can see here is the situation won't have changed dramatically. We see that women's education is across those illiterate women, literate but below middle school completed, and so on. What we see radio or television, and what we see is a monotonic decrease in the percentage of women who regard media messages about small family norm as acceptable with education. Illiterate women, 33% of illiterate women do not regard family planning messages as appropriate on the TV and radio, whereas only 2% of high school or above educated women regard these media messages. And indeed what we see here is we see immediate evidence for the relationship between women's education and desired family size. There is that great increase of one child when you go between 0 years of education and about 10 years of education. There are lots of other interesting things there. Under 5 child mortality rate decreases dramatically with women's education in this data. Ability to achieve their desired family size. Education improves that ability by improving child health, for one reason, because educated mothers are more likely to be aware of the importance of hygiene and of simple remedies such as oral rehydration therapy to address simple childhood diseases like diarrhea and so forth. So as a result, educated women suffer lower to achieve a given desired family size. They don't need to hoard, they don't need to engage in hoarding behavior in order to hedge against the possibility of the premature death of some of their children. It's a very powerful reason for high fertility, hoarding behavior. Having more children than you really want because because their mortality rates are high. So lowering infant mortality is one important route through which education improves desire. Education promotes literacy, so an educated woman can read information, she's more likely to be aware of family planning methods and to successfully use them as well. And thirdly, raising bargaining power of women. This means a woman's education increases her other actual earnings in the labor market because educated women have higher labor force participation rates, and in any given occupation more educated women command higher is stronger if they're more educated, or it can be that even if their potential economic position is higher, because they know that even if at the moment they're not working, if they were to need to work, for example, if the marriage dissolved and the woman had to go out to work in the labor market, she knows that she will command high wages because she's more educated. As a result, that strengthens their position even within marriage. So in other words, and which means that their preferences are given greater weight in household decision making. And this is the so-called bargaining power explanation. I do find the bargaining power term slightly unfortunate, but now another relationship that we have talked about is the relationship between women's education and the importance of mother's education to children's education is extremely well documented. There's a very significant relationship from mother's education to child schooling. And the hypothesized pathways again have been economic, the one that we discussed before. Greater labor force participation, greater earnings of more educated women mean that household income is higher and therefore more is spent on child goods, and therefore children's schooling can be better. Secondly, the bargaining power mechanism. On the goods that are preferred by the woman, which are typically for higher investments in children. It could be children's nutrition, it could be children's education. Child goods are generally preferred, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. And the third important mechanism, the third hypothesized pathway through which women's education raises child schooling, is through the direct home teaching mechanism or pathway, namely a more educated. Let's take a closer look at this so-called bargaining power mechanism. Early economic models of the household, which were put forward in about the 1960s, early 1970s, hypothesized that within a household there are identical preferences among the different members of the household. And these models were known as the unitary model of the household. Now, a lot of that in fact this unitary model of the household is unrealistic. The assumption that the preferences of different members within the family are similar is unrealistic. Preferences differ. For example, we now know that, because we have evidence on it, that women typically prefer smaller family sizes than men do. Because after all, it is women who bear it's the woman who bears the cost. So they generally have preferences for smaller families than men do. Secondly, there is now a lot of evidence that a greater proportion of women's earned income than men's goes to child goods. It's not so easy to accumulate this kind of evidence. The reason it's not so easy to do that is because usually household income is pooled. Women and men's income is pooled, and so it is difficult to assign expenditure. And can we see differences in consumption patterns out of those two incomes? We can't do that because typically income is pooled. However, in certain contexts, income is individually assignable. For example, in agriculture in Africa, it is traditional to have men's plots and women's plots. And income from those two plots, from farming on those two plots, is not pooled. And each party retains its income, and therefore expenditure patterns out of those two sets of income oftentimes men and women maintain different accounts, and their earned income is individually assignable from those as well. We see that a greater proportion of women's earned income goes to child goods, and if you look at expenditure patterns out of men's income, it's quite different. It goes on more goods like household, mortgages and things like that. It also goes on things like entertainment goods much more than women's income does. Things like and this is kind of quite universal. So this evidence of differing tastes, if you like, of dissension within the household, lack of coincidence of preferences of men and women, has led to new economic models, the collective models, the so-called collective models of the household, which are much more realistic in the sense that they do not assume a kind of a glued together household where a benevolent dictator of those members coincide with the allocations that this head of the household makes for everybody. These models recognize the individuality of household members. They theorize that decisions within the household are made through a bargaining process between the husband and the wife, and that the relative bargaining power of husband and wife determines the extent to which his or her preferences are taken, the extent choice within the household is made is what these models tell us about. And the bargaining power of the individual members within the household, the husband and wife, is determined by their personal endowments because, for example, education level of the husband and the wife, the contributions that they make to the household in other dimensions, the assets owned by the individual which he or she would be entitled to take away with them in case the marriage dissolved, parameters, which are things like the laws and rules that exist that impinge on women's status in society. So, for example, alimony laws, laws that determine what a father has to pay in terms of maintenance for if there's a divorce for the children and for the wife. So, the more pro-female such laws, the greater the bargaining power of women even within a So women's education is an important determinant of their bargaining power. More educated women are more able to steer household choices in the direction of their own preferences, which are, as I told you, more typically for higher expenditure on child goods, and the patterns differ. But how do these with Baha'i views about the purpose of women's education? The term bargaining power would make Baha'is uncomfortable because Baha'i writings do not talk about the purpose of women's education in terms of what their bargaining power that it might confer and so forth. However, Baha'i teachings do imply that it is unrealistic and wishful or on the basis of the enunciation of the spiritual principle of the inherent equality of men and women. Abdul Baha hints at this when he says that merely proclaiming women's equality is insufficient for achieving. In fact, I'd like to quote on that. Of attainment by men and women. And Abdul Baha says this, quote, "Woman must endeavor then to attain greater perfection, to be man's equal in every respect, to make progress in all in which she has been backward, so that man will be compelled to acknowledge her equality of capacity and attainment. Woman's actions will show her power. There will no longer be any need to proclaim it by words." Quote, "I hope that they may be even superior to men, versed in the sciences and yet detached, so that the world may bear witness to the fact that men and women have absolutely the same rights." This is from Abdul Baha on Divine Philosophy, Tudor Press, 1918. So, Abdul Baha here is suggesting that women may have to demonstrate even greater advancement than men in order for them. Does education have to raise women's earnings in order for its benefits to accrue? Well, we know that so far we've said that women's education leads to increased actual or potential earnings and thereby directly affects child outcomes. Increased actual potential earnings can also increase the woman's bargaining power, which means that a greater weight is given to her preferences, and through that route, that have been emphasized in the literature. But these rely on women taking part in the labor market and on having greater bargaining power. And I think these ideas, the thought that these might be the only or the main channels through which education of women has its beneficial impacts would jar somewhat against Baha'i teachings, because a frequent explanation given by Abdul Baha for own children more capably. And this direct teaching mechanism does not rely on increasing women's labour force participation or increasing their bargaining power. Now, the economic mechanism, of course, useful, but it doesn't apply in all contexts. For example, in societies where cultural norms or the gender division of labour is such that women do not tend to participate in market work, then the economic mechanism no increment to their earnings resulting from their education. For example, in agriculture, in most parts of developing countries, women's participation in agriculture is in those activities where there's no economic return to education. In other words, it's not in decision-making positions, it's in manual labor. So even if you had a literate and numerate woman working in an agricultural context, there would not be an economic return to her education then. If she had been in fertilizer packet, being able to decide how much fertilizer to apply with the amount of water that you have available for certain crops and not for other crops, then you would have an economic return to her education. But in most contexts, you do not have an economic return to women's education in agriculture. So what happens in those cases? Does that mean that women's education is not important in those contexts? And moreover, there are situations where mothers decide to stay at home voluntarily. Has a little beneficial effect. In other words, how important is the direct home teaching mechanism? I did find one paper in the literature that deals exactly directly with this issue, and that's published in the Journal of Political Economy, volume 107 in 1999, and this finds evidence in support of the direct home teaching mechanism at a time in India when the Green Revolution had just been introduced. Were made available to farmers, and these required the use of fertilizer and of irrigation. And these required farmers to be literate and numerate in order to be able to use this new technology, the new high-yielding variety seeds. At this time, these authors observed that women's literacy rates soared in India in these areas, even though they show that in these areas there was no economic return to women's schooling. Economic returns to women's literacy. And what they find, this is a very extensive paper, and this is a very brief summary of it. What they find is that children of literate mothers had significantly greater hours of home study. Literate women commanded a premium in the marriage market in the sense that men accepted significantly lower dowries for literate brides. And the authors suggest that these facts are consistent with the view that men value female literacy for the Now, an important implication of this sort of finding is that increasing labour market opportunities for women is not a necessary precondition for justifying investments in female schooling. And this is rather an important conclusion in light of statements in the Baha'i writings about the role of women as the primary educators of their children. And I have one last slide. I think that there is a challenge to gender equality in education, to the principle of gender equality in education, not only from religious fundamentalists, but also from a broader current that contests the universality of this principle and is apt to label it as a Western value. For example, in Pakistan in the mid-1990s, there was a study economic growth in Pakistan between the period of 1970 and 1985. And they found that one of the reasons why Pakistan's economic growth rate had been very low was because of the lack of education of women in Pakistan. When they, after they had published the study, they also went to Pakistan to present the study. They were presenting it before a group of 200 Pakistani economists who really did not like in criticizing this paper, and basically said, well, we don't accept this, you can go away. You guys show up here and tell us that we should educate our women, but look what education of women has done in your country. Divorce rates are high in your country, teenage delinquency is high, your society is being shattered by women's education, and you come and tell us that we should be educating our women. most pervasive and difficult of all the moral issues confronting the world at the moment is that of universal versus particular values. So I think this is a very important thread, the fact that this is not just religious fundamentalists, these were highly educated, South Asian economists who felt this way. And, and who knows, perhaps they have, something a teeny weeny little bit of a point there. I don't mean to say that they're right in criticizing women. That the content of education is also important. It isn't just, academic education and the 3 hours, but the content of what is learned in school is also important. To end on a more positive note, we know that the principle of gender equality in education is enshrined in numerous international documents. Most nations of the world are signatories to these documents, so at least there's lip service paid to that principle. And also this in the year 2000, when the international community adopted the 8 Millennium Development Goals, which aim to halve global poverty by 2015. And in this framework, gender is addressed by goal number 3, which is to promote gender equality and empower women. And the target associated with goal number 3 is to eliminate gender gaps in primary and secondary schooling by the year 2005. Now, I'm sure that it comes as no surprise that that goal was not achieved by 2005, which is the end of the current framework of the Millennium Development Goals. And that just draws our attention to the fact that although the principle of gender equality and gender equity has been adopted, the implementation of this principle remains a challenge for governments, for NGOs, for communities throughout the world, and not just in the developing countries, also to some extent in developed countries. The fact that women continue enunciated more than 150 years ago by Baha'u'llah of gender equality in education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kingdon, for privileging us with this far-sighted and comprehensive and very analytical presentation. I have one question. You quoted here a lot of sources and studies on different aspects of economy, socio-economic, regarding women, gender. To what extent, if any, those studies are aware of this? Women emancipation, because I assume, I know in my field it's almost non-existent. There are professors that they don't know anything about Baha'i studies or whatever, the influences within the Middle Eastern area, things like that. I wonder whether the same thing, the same pattern also happens because of the Islamic connotations and because of Iran and the policies and all the things that we know. Shouldn't be any limits for so whether there is lack of knowledge about these things, and if there is, then or if there is not, then to what extent you see any quote in each and every field, but there are certain fields that the Baha'i studies are or Baha'i principles are very
particularly emphatic about.
Yes. So female or women studies or gender studies are one of the main fields. So.
Yeah, I'm not aware of scholars in general being aware of Baha'i teachings on this topic, and I think that and laid back and not energetic enough in sharing this important fact with the research community, with the academic community over the decades. So I think part of the blame probably lies with us, with the Baha'i community as it were, and with Baha'i scholars. However, having said that, there are international forums of
But I very specifically said that the scholarship.
The scholarship, that's right. I mean, every March there's the UN Conference on Women's Equality, and every year the Baha'i international community is represented there, and Baha'i scholars go there. And to that extent, that does attract scholars. In fact, my own research officer was invited recently on a basis of a paper that she and I have co-authored as well. And she's not a Baha'i, but she was invited to present in that. So from that I guess that they invite quite a lot of academics to such forums to share their thoughts, and they also invite Baha'i international community representatives to share their thoughts. So there is a forum there where academics do get to hear some Baha'i teachings, but I think you're right that we have not been as proactive as we should be. And I think that it's kind of like zeitgeist, it is the spirit of the age, or has been. Not seek to find what the origins of this are. Not that Baha'is claim to be the originators of this principle, it's an age-old principle, equality, but we have a great deal of emphasis on it, and especially in a religious context. So I do agree with you that it would be a very good thing for people to know more about the emphasis the Baha'i faith places on this, and especially the novelty of the Baha'i contribution is this, that it's the statement. And I think that it should be better known.
Thank you. As far as I remember, there has been in recent years quite a dramatic decrease in women's fertility rate, at least in Middle Eastern countries and Islamic countries. To what extent do you think it has to do with investment in shed light on this?
I think that's a very valid point, that's a very, very good point. And in fact, the same thing has also been noticed in, for example, the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh among illiterate women. So the question is, how come? This is not education that's acting. So, I don't think that, I hope that, my presentation does not seem to suggest that education of women is the only factor. Other factors that also do. For example, demographers would argue that most of the effect from on fertility comes from long-term decline in mortality rates. So what they would say, I don't know if I can just draw on this.
Infant mortality.
Yeah, infant and child mortality rates.
No, I don't think that we are prepared for that.
Sure. Thank you.
Shall I put this?
So this is the total fertility rate and infant mortality rate. What demographers like Tim Dyson at London School of Economics, for example, and others have argued is that here's time going along, and so for example, here is the infant mortality rate, death rate, and supposing this is the pattern, maybe I've drawn it too steeply, but at any rate, over time, the mortality rate is falling. What they say is will follow the same pattern, but with a lag of maybe 10 or 15 years. So their point is that there's just the sheer weight of the fall in infant mortality rate will lead to a fall in the total fertility rate, which relies quite a lot on the hoarding behavior point. So the need to hedge against the possibility of the premature death of your offspring is reduced, and when people see that you don't need to, they demonstrate quite persuasively that as this falls also, but with a lag. And they show that for many countries. So yes, this is an important factor, and I don't know enough about the Middle East to know whether that is exactly what has gone on there, that namely that mortality rates have come down, and therefore with a lag this has come down. But I think part of the reason for the fall in education of women. And that has also been shown. So, I think that it is not to say, for example, in the Drajan Murthy paper, I don't know whether that can still come up. I'll just show you no, actually I don't have that particular slide, but let me see if I can remember correctly what slide it was. They have two tables, and I think I put one here. No, it does not have the child mortality table, because this is table 4. I think one of the tables, table 3 or table 5, had an equation which showed child mortality, because that's precisely one of the things that this paper tries to show. It said the motivation of this paper says that this kind of a point has been argued and has been used to suggest that therefore maternal education is not the driver of a fall in infertility rate. In fact, it is that caused the fertility rate decline. What they show in their paper is that they show total fertility rate regressions, but they also show regressions of child mortality rate, demonstrate that mother schooling has a very large positive effect on decline of child mortality rates. As a result, and then they put in child mortality rates in a regression of total fertility rate and show that in districts where the child mortality they demonstrate both of those effects quite nicely in this paper. Amartya Sen has also written about this.
And what about the interrelationship between the decreasing birth rate and education? Birth rate. So there was also a fall in birth rate.
The fall in birth rate and education. So in other words, fall in fertility rates.
Fertility, yes.
And education.
Yeah, but I separated. Not
birth rate. How would you define birth rate?
The number of births given per 1,000 women in a given period.
But why would that be a different quantity than, fundamentally different quantity than the total fertility rate, which is the total number of children born to a woman? It's not calculated exactly like that, but in each age-specific group, the number of children born in a given year.
I think a year, okay, per 1,000 or per 2,000,
sure.
Yeah. So I think it's somewhat different.
Oh, the crude birth rate, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, the crude birth rate.
Right.
Let me just see. I think I have got a slide which addresses that. It's right at the end. It's in a paper by...
I think in this, I'm trying to help you point. I think
yeah, sure.
in the case of the crude birth rate, the interrelationship between birth rate and in this case, you cannot rely, on changes in the death rate of infant and child death rate.
Okay. So in other words, it's a more direct relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not mediated by child mortality rates.
Exactly.
That's an interesting thought.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I will look up to see whether that relationship is greater. I do have one paper which I did not have the chance to show you because I had lots of other. Have a regression on the crude birth rate.
Yeah.
So here is the health impacts of education. TFR is the total fertility rate, crude birth rate, and death and GMR. So this is a regression of total fertility rate. This is cross-country data.
Right.
And so we see here that for education, they've got GER is gross enrollment ratio. 1 is for primary level, 2 is for secondary, and 3 is for tertiary level. F is for female. So this is the primary school gross enrollment ratio of girls, and that is the secondary school gross enrollment ratio of girls. So both of them lagged by 20 years. Yeah. So to a combination of female primary and female secondary school enrollment rates of 20 years previous, and multiplied by the family planning service score of the country, and they have an Africa dummy which shows that in Africa total fertility rate is higher by about 2.8, very, very substantial.
This is for the entire continent or special country?
No, this is cross-country data, so this would have included in this regression. That's why they're able to have an Africa demo.
Asia.
Then crude birth rate, we see, unfortunately, in the crude birth rate equation, they have not put directly the education variable.
Right.
So they have put in the total fertility rate, and that, of course, comes in very significantly, positively. The higher the total fertility rate, the greater the crude birth rate. But sorry, yeah, I thought that this may have had that, but it doesn't have the education.
Son has.
So you had a slide in which you mentioned the effects of religion. There was a slide showing that those who are Muslim, that meant that fertility rate was significantly higher.
Sure.
Have there been any studies on that focus on impact on fertility rate and women's education across religions? So high, but women's education might also be higher than, for example, Islam.
So what would be the
and
responsiveness?
If there are studies that involve Baha'is, would be particularly interested. Would be particularly interested in.
I'm not aware of it. I'm sure there are such studies. It's just that I'm not aware of it. So it will be very interesting to see whether the responsiveness of fertility to education differs by religion. Be very, very interesting. Because of certain rules that they have, certain principles that they have about not using contraception, it would mean that the women, even more educated women's ability to achieve their desired family size may not be able.
Yes, so look at Italy, which is a developed country, and
but very interestingly, Italy has a very, very low total fertility rate, about 1.4.
Right.
It is dramatic. So it's an interesting thing that it's very surprising that Italy. So either, although despite calling themselves Catholic, they're not, adhering to
exactly.
the principles of the.
interesting.
May I get that? Go ahead.
No.
Is fertility rate among Baha'is in any given country like the States where you have data? Is it lower because of the teaching?
That's a very interesting point, but I have not looked at it. Let me write these down, because I said to Huda that I will want to do more research in this area, and these questions will give me some ideas as to what could be researched in this area.
Because this would show that the teachings of the grandfather had some impact on the actual behavior of
Islamic countries.
Yes.
Is a
That's a good point.
But I'm not sure whether you have data for it.
No, but I'm saying in a Western country, the birth rate is already low usually. So if you compare it to usually the higher fertility rate, then it's
the comparison is within the
Yes.
different communities in a given country.
oh yes. Of course.
I don't know if in Iran, for example, you will have data for
You see, they will not be recorded. Possibly, they will not be recorded as that. They will just not have a box for that religion.
and in India.
In India, well, no, unfortunately not, because of the fact that there are just so few. I mean, there are more than 1 million Baha'is in India, but as a proportion of the population, that's 0.1%.
But for example, take some African countries which are generally close.
Sure, that's true. Yeah, I think that it could be done in some data sets. It exists. For example, if you look at the World Values Survey, which has been done in 45 countries, Baha'i is listed as a separate religion. However, I wonder. I've got that data. If I looked at it, whether it would be a sufficient number of Baha'is to really make that as a separate category to look at. Yes. But any regression equation, the Baha'is would drop out of it because of the sheer low numbers.
Maybe this could be done on a very local basis in a certain place that there is a big concentration of Baha'is, and then
Yes. Yes, it could be done.
Yes, there is a.
Well, for example, in the South Pacific, some of the islands in the South Pacific have a high proportion of Baha'is.
Baha'i writings, because as far as I'm aware, there is nothing in the Baha'i writings to emphasize either large or small families. There's no exhortation on family size. It's completely neutral from that point of view, whereas of course there are some religions or religious sects that emphasize, Jewish mothers have more children or something like that, or whatever. Yeah, no, that's okay. I should take that.
Nothing like it.
You were talking about the South Asian, South Pacific communities. Possibly it might not be the best one, because there you wouldn't be able to control for other. I mean, it's
it's
homogeneous. It's its own culture.
Yeah, it's ethnically homogeneous, other than Baha'is and whatever is the local dominant community.
So you'd want to have it.
I just would like to make 2 comments, and then if you could also comment on that. One thing is about just the Western world's obsession with fertility. I mean, when they look at developing world, the only thing they look at is fertility, and and I think that to some extent just economic system that we have in the world. And another thing is that I think the fact that female education has a positive impact, I mean, on social and economic development, or that there are economic benefits associated with it. I think this has been known for long, but at the same time, it's also known that people's actions are not to a large greater extent influences people's actions and behavior. So that just the fact that this is of economic benefit to the country does not necessarily mean that that you're going to invest more in female education if it goes against your values.
I think that those are very thoughtful and important points. But that they are totally almost totally ignored in economic analysis of this sort. And I think part of the reason for it is, I would like to think that it's not because of naivety, but I think it's because of just lack of emphasis on it, because, for example, data does not exist on it, for one. But I think that the reason why data does not exist on it make a sort of some move in the direction of trying to measure these things which are usually unmeasurable, like values. In this survey that I just mentioned, World Values Survey, unfortunately it's a small data set on a large number of countries, so about 2,000 2,000 individuals per country roughly. Some countries more than in others. For example, the India data set may have observations. So relatively small data sets, but this data set does collect a lot of information on what is typically unmeasured. So they use a lot of psychological scales, like the Likert type responses and so on, to measure things like, for example, extent of belief in God. They try and collect information on a lot of things which have up to recently not been captured in the typical household survey format. So I think that social sciences, I feel, in a very rudimentary stage, with us paying a lot of attention to things that are visible and easily measurable, and paying very little attention to things which are profoundly important but which are not yet captured. My introduction is that I've done some work on happiness issues. Of course, that has been the preserve of study mainly by psychologists traditionally, but economists have been dabbling in that in the last 10 years or so as well. And in that, it's very clear in that people's happiness is profoundly determined by a lot of unobserved. likely to be happier than people who don't give to charity. Why is
Or
that?
do social work, I mean,
People who do social work, exactly. And exactly, and people who are more attached to material things are less happy. And so attachment to material things, well, how do you measure that? So developing better measures for things that are not so easily measurable is what we need to do. Countries, that seems to suggest that seems to point attention to the fact that why are we so obsessed with fertility? Why are we regarding lower fertility as a good thing? And I think that there is a sort of view. There are two views on it. One is a kind of population pessimism, which this whole literature is effectively tacitly subscribing to. Yeah. Neutrality or population optimism view, which is that each individual that is born on this earth is an asset, is a valuable addition to humanity, and so forth. And so we shouldn't necessarily be seeking to do this. But I don't know, I don't know where you would think the balance lies in today's world, knowing what we know about climate change, about the environmental pressures, and so forth. It is, it's not for me to judge, but those are some of the factors that would be relevant. And one point that I want lowering of fertility rates among less educated women in the Middle East, and indeed in some parts of India among illiterate women. One of the points that, for example, Amartya Sen makes against the demographers who argue that total fertility rate just follows a time trajectory 10 or 15 years later after the total something happens before something else doesn't mean that the thing that happened before caused what happened later. There are lots of other factors that are involved, and although he doesn't give that example, when I was doing my undergraduate economics, one of the essays that we had was to comment on the following phrase: post hoc ergo propter hoc. So I said, in the first place, can you explain what this means? I asked my professor. So it's a Latin phrase which means Kaldor, who's an economist, gave of the fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc, is that he said, well, just because Christmas cards arrive before Christmas doesn't mean that the arrival of Christmas cards causes Christmas to happen. Or just because the cock crows before sunrise doesn't mean that it causes sunrise. So I think that there are quite.
Not enough.
No, it's not enough.
Maybe it's part of the explanation.
It's part of the explanation, but it's not.
But we are not in exact sciences.
It's not an exact science. This is the problem we always face. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much again, and thank you for coming. And I wish you the rest of your stay here to be very fruitful and enjoyable.
Thank you very much.
And thanks a lot. We
Thank you for having us.
Next week we will have Mr. Douglas Martin, former member of the University House of Justice, that will speak about the Sarah Farmer
and the American Baha'i community of the 1800s, early 1900s. Excuse me.
Yes. Next Wednesday. Thursday. 22nd.
At the same time, 4 o'clock?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Same place, same time.
We'll get to the...
תודה רבה.
Sure.
מעניין.
יש לכם תוכניות?
זה לא תוכניה, זה רק הזמנה. אבל אם אתם מעוניינות, יש... את השם ואת
numbers of births who can't economically support the children, the suffering that causes. I mean, there's another side to it, and I know you know that.
Until when you're here?
I'm sorry?
Until when you're staying?
17, Saturday.
Okay.
Because when we come to give a lecture, they very kindly allow us to stay for a little visit to the Baha'i places.
stuff, and that's why I meant that
Yeah.
it is the timing, the date is not
That's
dependent.
true. That's right.
So
Yes.
yours is exception.
I was very glad to come at a time that's suited.
Enjoyed it very much. You're staying in London?
Yes, I work at University of London.
UCL.
Well, no, actually, it's very near UCL. It's opposite. My office is, I'm on this side of the just opposite.
Yes.
That's right. But my office is a little bit.
The one with the glasses.
Yeah, exactly. But my office is not like I'm in an outpost. There's lots of smaller buildings further on. God is where, Woven is there. I'm in one of the outposts in a nice
Nostalgia. Golden Square.
That's the reason why.
That's right, nostalgia. When were you in school?
I finished 97.
You know, India is now number.
Well, I was at LSE between 96 and 97 as a research officer. So yeah, I coincided a little bit by
Psychology.
Good time.
Yeah.
Enjoy staying.
Yeah, when it's a nice place, absolutely. I presented there myself, but
I have a good friend there, Nima Mina.
in which
He's in comparative literature.
okay.
And we know also Heidi Walcher.
Okay. I don't know.
She worked at Iran, and she's a little bit also into the Baha'i.
Oh, really?
Heidi Walcher.
And if it
Heidi
hasn't,
Walcher. Okay, I'll look for that name. Yeah. Well, I belong to a the 6 colleges of University of London that are based in Bloomsbury, SOAS, Institute of Education, Birkbeck, London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, School of Pharmacy, and I think that's it, that's 6, isn't it? So we've got a little group called the London International Development Centre. It's hefty funded, and so there I'm on the strategy committee of that. From SOAS. I'll tell you the names. Andrew Dorwood is from SOAS. He works on poverty issues. And Colin Colton, Nigel, I can't remember Sarah. These 3 people are from SOAS. But yeah, because they work in
They've probably been there when I was there, but
that's
maybe
right,
working
yeah.
on different things.
Exactly, different things. Yeah.